Previously, I made a video about using the FX6 and the Alpha 1 as a tandem, and why I prefer the Alpha 1 with the FX6 over other cameras. Well, today we're going to revisit that topic as I shot a fashion event recently using these cameras, and I have observations and footage to share. So, with all that out of the way, let's get started. Last video, I discussed camera synergy between the FX6 and the A1. And when it comes to live events, I've had to continually reassess cameras and specs that are important to myself and to clients. And I remember when the Panasonic S1 was first released, and I thought I'd found the perfect live event camera. In that, it was a hybrid photo-video camera capable of 24 megapixel images and full-frame 4K video with respectable dynamic range. Then along came the A7S III that was so undeniably impressive and convenient that I had to change systems. And later on, the FX6 caught my attention, and although it lacked key features at launch, I thoroughly enjoyed the user experience, in particular when paired with the 28-135 f4 power zoom. I rented the Alpha 1 for a few projects, skeptical at first as it seemed like overkill in every regard, from 8K video to 50 megapixel images. Eventually, I had rented the camera so frequently that the Alpha 1 had inevitably won me over. So I sold my A7S III along with a few lenses, and ever since then, the synergy between the FX6 and the A1 has continued to impress, which brings me to Fashion Week. So for London Fashion Week, I used the 100-400 f4.5 to 5.6 on the Alpha 1, and generally I stayed on the conservative focal length of 100 to 250 millimeters. So image quality has always been excellent on this lens, although I have considered selling it and looking into the 70-200 f2.8 Mark II. However, I cannot seem to let this lens go. My colleague used the 35mm f1.8 on the FX6, a lens that I've also considered letting go and opting for the 35mm f1.4 G Master instead, but more on that later. So for the duration of the event, I used the battery grip on the A1, and I never had to change batteries. Ergonomically, it's nice to have the thicker, deeper grip while shooting, and I've covered the A1's photo capabilities extensively in the past. It takes excellent photos, and it leaves quite a bit of flexibility to crop into photos in post if needed. Autofocus was precise most of the time. Now, there was a minor error here and there, but I would say it's more reflective of user error on my part, but you can take a look for yourself. Overall, colors are reproduced very well in my estimation. The images retain a great deal of detail, and this is what I've come to expect from the A1. Now, in the past, I've shot with Nikon, Canon, and I've owned the Panasonic GH2 all the way through the GH5. As previously mentioned, I found the latest Panasonic S series to be especially excellent, in part due to its full-frame capabilities like with the S1, although the S5 was no slouch either. I'm familiar with Sony photo cameras, and overall I find the A1 to have superior color reproduction in that you don't get Sony's overbearing green tones as you would on previous cameras, even as recent as the A7S III. FX6 footage was recorded in Cinetone and filmed in 4K 60p. Despite the event taking place in an interior location, there was a degree of natural light pouring in. At first it was minimal and inconsequential, but by the second half of the show, natural light was really pouring into the space, blowing out the highlights. However, with the auto electronic variable ND filter switched on, the FX6 adapted accordingly and rectified overexposure issues. It was my colleague's first time using the FX6 for this kind of event. She noted the camera was shockingly lightweight. Her only gripes were the lack of in-body stabilization, the small screen, the playback thumbnail options, and the FX6's menu, which was cumbersome to navigate through. Bear in mind she's coming from a Panasonic S5 and an A7S III background, so she's accustomed to the newer menu system of the A7S III and of course the in-body stabilization of the Panasonic S5. So I've had the FX6 for a little over a year now, and it's interesting because when it was first released, the consensus among camera owners seemed to be quite tepid in regards to the FX6's launch features, as the A7S III at the time could do most of, if not more, than what the FX6 could do. And even to this day, the A7S III can do 4K 120p without going into S&Q mode. Plus, the A7S III was cheaper and more compact, making it more gimbal friendly. The FX6 felt incomplete due to lacking one key feature, and that key feature was touch tracking autofocus. You see, prior to firmware 2.0, the FX6 had a much more clumsy solution to touch tracking, where you had to move the little joystick around to get objects in focus. When firmware 2.0 arrived, I had never seen so much improvement coming from one firmware update. And I used to own Panasonic cameras that are generally replete with very generous firmware updates. I went into great detail in a prior video about how much had changed on the FX6 at the time. This new update brought in 16-bit HDMI RAW recording, the aforementioned touch tracking autofocus system, bokeh control, 4-channel audio metering, picture cache recording, and of course, focus breathing compensation. So why am I mentioning firmware 2.0 now? Well, the A1 lacks focus breathing compensation, despite less expensive cameras like the A7 IV having this feature. Very much in the same way that the FX6 lacked touch tracking autofocus, while the less expensive A7S III had this feature at the time. And I don't feel as though I'm making a big issue out of a small omission. For instance, the A1 doesn't have an FX6 feature like picture cache recording, and I hardly think of it as the A1 is a photo camera. And while picture cache recording is a beneficial feature on the FX6, it's definitely a video-centric feature, and it doesn't really limit your creativity and user experience on the A1 like this lack of focus breathing compensation. And if you're not familiar with the feature, focus breathing compensation applies a 10 to 12% crop on your image and entirely eliminates any focus breathing or pulsing. Now, focus breathing is not really an issue with older Sony lenses like the 35mm and the 55mm f1.8 Zeiss lenses, which are the ones that I use for precisely this reason. But as you move up to the modern Sony G Masters like the 35mm f1.4 or the 50mm f1.2, you encounter substantial jarring focus breathing when recording video. And really, Sony are shooting themselves in the foot, because for all these fancy new G Master lenses that take pristine, superior images over the primes of yesteryear, I'll stick with my old lenses, and I don't think I'm alone in that. So hopefully Sony takes this under advisement and updates the Alpha 1 accordingly with focus breathing compensation. But that's all for now, and as always, if you found this video helpful or insightful, give a big thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, comment below, let me know what you think, and I'll see you in the next one.